You're listening to the NeuroCareers podcast with Dr. K. Episode number 13, part 2. Dear NeuroCareers podcast listeners, today we are continuing our conversation with Dr. Anthony Barnhart. This is the second part of our conversation with him, and we are exploring the science of magic and possibilities to become a scientist working in this field. Please stay tuned. Welcome, Dr. Barnhart. You mentioned the Science of Magic Association and the third conference which took place in London in July of this year. You presented also at that conference. I'm very curious, and I'm sure our listeners also are curious. What did you present at that conference?
So what did I present? I presented the strangest, most labor-intensive experiment of my life. And it ended up being my sabbatical project. I had a sabbatical during the pandemic. I hadn't anticipated on a pandemic happening during my sabbatical, so I had to pivot and come up with a new plan on the fly. And I turned back to a bunch of data that I'd collected years ago but hadn't had the time to analyze. Data that were exploring self-deception in magicians. Now, self-deception was a new topic for me. I'd read some of the literature, but I certainly did not have a deep knowledge of it. And upon reading the literature, I came to realize that the evidence to support the existence of self-deception is scant. There's not good evidence for it. All the examples of self-deception that are held up in popular psychology texts are not strong evidence of self-deception, right? Like people can be motivated to lie publicly, to misrepresent what their beliefs are. That's not necessarily self-deception. And people in laboratory experiments often present themselves in ways that don't match their actual experience of the world, right? Like that's the problem with survey research much of the time. Like participants will try to please the researcher or present a persona that they think the researcher wants to tap into. So I thought that I had found a clear, measurable example of self-deception in performing magicians. And here I'm defining self-deception as an instance where a person both knows the truth, but pushes that truth into their unconscious mind. And what's available to consciousness is the faulty, the untruth, the lie, the self-deception. And so anecdotally, there's an instance of self-deception in many magicians who are rehearsing. Magicians often rehearse in front of a mirror so that they kind of have the perspective of their audience. But there are these anecdotal accounts of magicians blinking their eyes the moment they carry out a deceptive technique in front of their mirror, thereby blinding themselves to any evidence that they're no good at the sleight of hand, right? So they know the truth, right? They know they're engaging in deceptive action, but consciously they're filtering out any evidence of that deceptive action for themselves. So we tried to elicit this behavior in the lab to provide evidence of self-deception and see if we could push around that behavior through laboratory manipulations. So we got a bunch of magicians to learn a bunch of coin magic. We put together a routine, a series of magic tricks, all with a coin or a series of coins, using a variety of pieces of sleight of hand, some of which would be totally unfamiliar to these performers, some of which would be very familiar to them. So we manipulated the complexity of the sleight of hand or the difficulty of the sleight of hand. And we gave people a week to learn this complicated routine. We invited them into the laboratory and we videotaped them performing it in front of a mirror with full visual feedback and in front of a camera with no visual feedback. So that's more like a performance setting. And unbeknownst to them, we were looking at their eye blinks. So we were videotaping them. And after the fact, we went back and we went through the videos frame by frame to the tune of 100,000 frames of video. And for every frame, we evaluated whether their eyes were open or whether they were closed, and whether this frame belonged to a moment of deceptive action or not. So did we find evidence of self-deception? Not really. Indeed, we found that magicians are more apt to blink their eyes when they're carrying out deceptive action than when they aren't, but that blinking is more prominent in a performance setting than it is in a rehearsal setting. So it didn't suggest to us that magicians are blinking their eyes to edit their experience of their performance. So what purpose could it serve? We think the blinking is serving as a cue to the audience that this is a moment when nothing important is happening. Audiences are actually sensitive to eye blinks. There's research that shows that when people are watching video of a speaker, they blink their eyes just after the speaker blinks their eyes. Because when do we blink our eyes? We blink our eyes when we believe it's a moment when there's nothing important to extract from the environment. And so what's a useful cue to that? Well, the speaker's blinking, right? Speakers also blink at moments when they just finished an idea or at moments when nothing important is happening. And so we think magicians are using their eye blinks to cue the audience that this is a time when you should feel comfortable blinking your eyes. And the time that it would be most useful for an audience to blink their eyes is in the middle of a magician's deceptions, right? It'll help the audience be deceived more readily. Of course, this is speculative right now. Our experiment is agnostic to why those blinks were happening when they were. It'll take another researcher, maybe me, to validate that post-hoc interpretation of the findings. So I will say there still is a lack of evidence to support the existence of deep self-deception, where we both know the truth and push that truth out of our consciousness. And psychology needs to do better.
I'm sure you will make a significant contribution to this field. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very interesting to learn about the association and the conference. I already want to attend the conference very much. And I'm sure there will be an interest from students to attend this type of conference.
Yes. And our goal is to make the conference inclusive to all types. So we have grants available for undergraduates and graduate students who are interested in attending. We host the conference every 2 years, at least when a pandemic isn't happening. We've gone 3 years since the last one. But the goal is to host the next conference in the summer of 2024. We haven't landed on a place yet, but it's been our goal generally to bounce between the United States and Europe. So I'm anticipating that we'll try to host it in the United States the summer of 2024. So keep an eye out for that.
Thank you. At the beginning of you talking about this conference that just happened in July, you mentioned the person who talked about his experience learning magic while being a psychologist. And you yourself have an experience of being a magician and then becoming a psychologist. I want to ask about the path. What does it take to become a psychologist for a magician and then for a psychologist to learn some magic?
Sure. Yeah, I was a professional magician, but the part of being a professional magician that I despised was the business side of being a professional magician, right? Like, unless you're like really high profile, you're doing all of the work, right? You're marketing yourself, you're booking the shows, you're dealing with finances, you're doing all the business of magic, which is not the part I enjoyed. I didn't feel like I was good at self-promotion the way you have to be a full-time performer. And so naively, I thought, there will be more job stability in academia, right? As a psychologist, yeah, maybe not. I didn't see being a full-time entertainer as a secure job prospect for me. Ultimately, I think that was the bottom line that influenced my direction in psychology. I'm certainly not alone, right? There are lots of people who started out as professional magicians who are now academics, many of them psychologists. And that's why the Science of Magic Association, as it stands right now, is dominated by psychologists, because there have been so many of us who have followed this path. For a psychologist to learn magic, I think there are a remarkable number of resources available. I have done some work articulating magic, teaching magic that psychologists can learn very quickly, implement very quickly, and use as a teaching tool in the classroom. Folks should reach out to me if they're psychologists or educators who want to bring some magic into the classroom. I have resources that I can share. But they should also, again, turn their attention to the Science of Magic Association. In the year when we couldn't host a conference because of the pandemic, we pivoted and hosted a series of webinars. We called them Conversations on Science, Magic, and Society. And each one had a different focus on some topic area that the science of magic had something to say about, and brought together a panel of researchers and magicians to discuss that. And one of those was on magic in the classroom. And we had an educator who's also a magician who talked about some of the ways that he uses magic. He was a high school teacher. We had Richard Weissman, famous psychologist who has had great success educating through magic, with magic. And we had a member of the Science of Magic Committee who is an educator in South America who also uses magic. And so that webinar highlighted some resources that are available to folks and highlighted techniques that educators can use to bring magic into the classroom. You don't have to have a deep training in magic to implement some of these ideas. You can use videos of magic. It doesn't have to be live performance of magic to bring it into the classroom. One of our goals in the Science of Magic Association is to put together a compendium of resources for educators that can help them bring magic into the classroom and into the laboratory. So I'm hoping that we'll get that up and running in the coming months. So keep an eye out for that, I guess. But to bring it full circle, if you want to learn magic, the fastest way to do so is go to the library. Every library has a section on magic, and it has some of the foundational magic texts that contain techniques that beginners can use as a springboard into deeper things. So look for the Mark Wilson course on magic. Most libraries have that. Look for Henry Hayes' Amateur Magician's Handbook. That's in many libraries. And there's an old text called the Tarbell Course in Magic, which is exactly that. It's a multi-volume magic course that's maybe not the place to start, but it's an early-ish resource that people should call upon to learn all manner of magical techniques.
Thank you. We will add the information about resources also in our podcast notes.
Wonderful.
You talked about using magic in the classroom. At the beginning of our talk, you also said that you are using the science of magic while working with students.
Mm-hmm.
Can you provide at least one example of how this can be used in the classroom?
Sure. Okay, well, I'll tell you like the most obvious place that I do this, which is not going to be a place most people can do this. I teach an entire course on the cognitive science of magic. And the course has nefarious purposes, right? Like students sign up for it thinking it's going to be all about magic, and it is all about magic, but it's really a way to deceive them into learning about psychology. It is in many ways an introductory psychology course through the lens of performance magic. Mm-hmm. And my greatest goal for this course is to use it to identify early undergraduate students who would be good candidates to work in the lab, who could get excited about these topics and would want to dive into them more deeply. And so most of my lab is populated by students who have taken this course at one point in time, probably when they were freshmen. But let me tell you about concrete ways that folks can use magic in the classroom. I use it a lot in my sensation and perception class. One of the topics that I've had great success using magic to exemplify is the so-called Gestalt laws. These are really low-level, overlearned cues in the environment that shape how we group visual stimuli together to decide which features of the world belong together in an object and which features of the world are sort of background features. How do we differentiate a figure from a background and things like that? And one of these principles that I talk about a lot is Gestalt good continuation, our tendency to fill in an object if it's partially occluded, if it's partially covered up. So, like if you see a dog walking behind a picket fence, you don't perceive it as just little slices of dog, right? Like you take those little slices of dog and you combine them in your mind's eye to perceive an entire dog, even though part of that dog is obscured. Well, magicians exploit this tendency to fill in incomplete information all over the place, right? So the classic illusion, sawing a person in half, only works because of the audience's tendency to fill in incomplete information in a way that respects smooth continuity over abrupt change, and to fill in information in the simplest, most likely way. So in the sawing illusion, a person's put inside this big old box. You only see their head coming out of one end of the box, their feet coming out of the other end of the box. They saw apart the middle of the box, they separate those two halves. The trick only works if the audience perceives the feet coming out of one end of the box to belong to the same body as the head protruding from the other side of the box. The moment the audience thinks that those feet might belong to a different body than that head belongs to, that trick fails, right? So the magicians have to come up with ways to kind of convince the audience or encourage the audience to apply this law of good continuation. And how do they do it? Well, there are little doors on the side of the box, and they can open one door to show the arm of the person in the box. They can open up the other door to show the side of the leg. Does that preclude alternative interpretations? Not at all. But it's enough of a suggestion to encourage the audience to apply this Gestalt good continuation law and perceive it as one body that unites those feet and that head. My very first Science of Magic publication, which actually was accepted for publication 12 years ago today, was on Gestalt laws in magic. And I used the example of a cut and restored rope trick in that paper, where this is going to be hard to describe in podcast form, but if I'm holding a length of rope in my two hands, people assume that that rope is continuous, right? Like it's one long piece of rope that I'm just holding between my two hands. When oftentimes the magician's doing something different. They're holding one long piece of rope and one short piece of rope that's just sticking out of the top of their hand. Well, the audience perceives it as one long, continuous piece of rope because of Gestalt good continuation, because they fill in the rope behind the magician's hand to perceive it as continuous. So in that first publication, I included a video demonstration of this principle at play in a cut and restored rope trick, right? You don't have to learn a cut and restored rope trick to use that as a teaching example. You can play the video and then explain it and use it as a segue into discussing Gestalt good continuation and the multitude of other Gestalt laws that magicians exploit quite readily. So yeah, those are the techniques that I tend to use. I use magic tricks to make explicit these processes that are usually happening covertly and automatically without people's awareness. These are assumptions that we make about the world without even realizing we're making those assumptions. And that's why they're so easily exploited by magicians, because they're automatic, they're overlearned, and they mostly happen outside of consciousness. The assumption just happens, it guides our perceptions without us knowing it's happening.
What was the most unexpected thing you learned through this process of studying the science behind magic?
Well, this self-deception thing was very surprising to me. I thought for sure we were going to have strong evidence of self-deception there, and then it flip-flopped, and it was exactly the opposite finding. So that was surprising. And surprising in a delightful way that's going to lead to new research, right? If I'd done the self-deception, if it had turned out the way I'd expected, probably would have been a one and done experiment that wouldn't have led anywhere. It would have been just a nice example of self-deception. We've proven that it's a thing, but we haven't proven that it's a thing, and it's led us in unique directions. So that's exciting. A very surprising thing from the rhythm research, which probably won't be surprising to the average listener, the models of temporal attention that are dominant in psychology and neuroscience have highlighted one frequency, one sort of time code that seems to be optimal for this kind of entrainment. So there's one kind of brainwave frequency that seems like most adept at entraining, of aligning itself with a rhythm in the world. And in these early experiments, we sampled a number of different frequencies for this auditory rhythm across that range that's been highlighted as effective for entrainment. Well, we found strong evidence of entrainment at one of those frequencies, but no entrainment at another frequency that's within that same band. And so this highlights a place where the previous work is limited. We have to figure out why entrainment is perhaps so sensitive to rather subtle distinctions in frequency. So that was surprising and is leading to more work that needs to be done. And I don't know that I want to go into it now. Some of my work has pitted hypotheses from magic theorists against hypotheses from psychologists. And in one of my works on inattentional blindness, we designed an experiment that could adjudicate between these competing hypotheses, one from magic, one from psychology. Going into it, I was certain the magician was right, that the hypothesis from magic would win out. And that is not how it panned out. It was one place where psychologists really seemed to have a leg up on magicians, where the hypothesis gleaned directly from psychology theory was supported by the evidence, and the hypothesis from magic was rather firmly refuted. So I think that's one of the nice things about a young research program like this. There's not a lot of precedent for it. So we can test hypotheses that seem obvious and be disproven very readily. And that's a recipe for scientific progress, right? Like, we move forward by disproving hypotheses, not by providing support for hypotheses. So the fastest way to engage in strong science is by pitting hypotheses against each other and disproving one of them. And I think early disciplines like this one provide some great fodder for fast progress because so little has been done.
I agree. And I think it's good to hear for students who usually are very fixated on a certain hypothesis and they get very discouraged, yes, when it's not being supported.
Yeah. So this model of science of pitting hypotheses against each other is called strong inference. And it's hard to do, right? Like, it's rare to find two theories that make predictions that are in direct conflict with each other. But I believe it is the most powerful way to do science because it discourages you from becoming sort of religiously engaged with your hypothesis. You're not getting married to a hypothesis. If you can design a strong inference experiment, you're going to be happy regardless of the outcome, right? Like, either way, something is going to be supported and something's going to be refuted, and it's going to lead to further science. And it's a way to sort of become disengaged, to become less married to a specific hypothesis or a specific theoretical focus. Yeah, because we know that getting married to these hypotheses, it leads to bad science. It's like the Society for Psychical Research, where they started doing experiments just to try to confirm their beliefs about the world, rather than trying to find evidence to understand reality. Yep.
It's evident that you have so much potential of doing science. There are so many things that are unknown that need to be further investigated. And my question is, what are your future plans? What is your main area of research that you are planning on?
I really do think that I'm an attention researcher primarily. That is the domain that most of my research speaks to. Even the self-deception thing is really about attention when it comes down to it. And I spoke earlier about offbeats that magicians use, and I've tested this one kind of offbeat using rhythm. But there's been really no science exploring this multitude of cues that people use to determine when to pause attention, when attention should be relaxed versus engaged. And so my greater research program is really exploring these magicians' offbeats, because there are a lot of these techniques that are unknown to science, that haven't been tested, and that can very easily integrate with more formal psychological theories. So right now, my students and I are exploring the role that humor plays in magic. And there are ideas that magicians and scientists have about why humor leads to this pausing of attention, but none of them have been supported by any kind of science yet. There's been no experimentation on this. So my students and I have a series of experiments going right now to better understand why humor may be so useful for magicians as a tool of misdirection. I'm also interested in kind of bringing all of these disparate research topics together in a domain known as event perception. So some of the best psychological science in perception right now is in the area of event perception. So we're presented with what seems to be a continuous experience of the world, right? But in order to make sense of the world, we have to chop it up into seeming causes and effects. And so what are the cues in our world that dictate where we judge that one event has ended and a new event has begun? There's really great work going on in this area, and I think it speaks directly to what magicians are doing, right? Magicians have to encourage audiences to perceive certain things as causes of these effects. And the things that they need the audience to perceive as the causes aren't the real causes, right? So magicians are using all manner of cues to suggest to the audience where these event boundaries lie, to encourage them to create this inner simulation of the external world that allows the illusion to happen. And so I think there's a great marriage to be had here between some of this kind of low-level work that I've been doing on attention and magic and the higher-level work that the event perception researchers have been doing. I think these two areas can be married pretty well. And we've got a series of experiments in the works that are going to be among the first to bring together these two areas. So those are the things that I'm pretty excited about right now. But as you can tell from what I've talked about, I'm also totally willing to go on diversions and test hypotheses that are just weird and exciting, because they keep me energized and they get my students excited about science as well.
Yes, absolutely. And this is the work that you are doing as a scientist and you are planning to do as a scientist. Is there any magical trick, maybe very complex, that you would like to master as a professional magician in the future?
Oh, wow. There's no particular trick that I have in mind. There are some pieces of sleight of hand that it would be valuable for me to be better at for the kinds of experiments that I'm creating. Okay, so I mentioned that I had a sabbatical in spring of 2021, right smack dab in the middle of the pandemic. Well, before I knew a pandemic was coming, one of my goals for that sabbatical that I didn't actually put in the sabbatical proposal was to build a new act. I told myself that I would not be a performing magician again until I had tenure, and then I would take it up again. But I also knew that I couldn't perform the act that I used to perform because I'm not the same person I used to be, right? Like the voice of my act does not represent who I am now. So I would need to build a new act. And so one of my sub goals for the sabbatical was to build a new act. But then there was this pandemic. And instead of doing the things I'd planned for my sabbatical, I found myself at my dining room table next to my kindergartner who was doing virtual kindergarten during the pandemic. And so I certainly did not build a new act, but one of my long-term goals is to build a new act. I have a vision for it that represents who I am as a psychologist nowadays, that has my voice, and that also kind of that's infotainment in a way, that's using magic in a very entertaining way, but that also teaches the audience something along the way. My goal is to build an entire act that teaches about the psychology of superstition through exploration of superstitious beliefs around the world. And so it's teaching some psychology while also having some, what I envision will be powerful magic. So I guess without giving you any specific magic tricks, that's one of my goals.
Very, very exciting, very interesting psychology of superstition. I even immediately imagined some exhibition.
Yeah.
I think it would be so interesting, especially for children, young adults to explore that. So I wish you all possible success with this plan.
I need another sabbatical, and it needs to not happen during a pandemic. Can you make that happen for me? Can you talk to the administration?
With my magic. Yes. We're nearing the end of our podcast, and the actual title of our podcast is Neurocareers Doing the Impossible. So what would be your advice to students who are still searching and trying to discover their careers, and sometimes who get discouraged because they think that some new things, something that they really want to do, is virtually impossible?
Okay, so I guess my first advice will be for those students who are planning to pursue graduate school. Whether it be neuroscience or psychology, I think the advice is the same. Shop around for a mentor who has the worldview and the demeanor that you can work well with. It's not about the program. It's not at all about the program. You're going to learn the same skill sets regardless of which program you're in. What differs is the mentorship that you will receive. And so, for example, I wouldn't be where I'm at now if I hadn't had this mentor who was a Renaissance man, who was willing to support me in going down these blind alleyways. And that's unique, right? Like, I think that's not the case with many graduate mentors. Many graduate mentors, they have their grant from the NSF that dictates the research that needs to take place. They need people to be working on that research. And so they aren't going to have the kind of flexibility that would have been right for me. I mean, perhaps if you're a student who knows what kind of research they want to do, what kinds of hypotheses they want to test, then by all means work with that mentor who's going to force your hand to be working on this one set of grant projects. But just know what you want, right? Like, find a person you can work with, seek out a mentor, not a program. That's my first piece of advice. And chat them up early, right? Email these people. They may seem intimidating, right? It seems intimidating, but even if they're psychology or neuroscience famous, they're not famous, right? Like, they seem like these big personalities, but psychology and neuroscience are small worlds. And these people will be incredibly pleased to learn that someone's been reading their research and has taken inspiration from their research. So students shouldn't feel intimidated reaching out to these researchers who they think they would like to work with. The researchers will be pleased to receive their emails and will be excited about it. Okay, so that's the first piece of advice. Seek out a mentor. Second piece of advice, regardless of whether you think you're going into graduate school or going into the workforce, is gain chops in research methods and statistics. Even if you think you're going to be a clinician in some form, focus a lot of your effort and energy on learning research methods and statistics, even if that's not where your passion lies, because those are the skill sets that are most marketable in psychology and neuroscience, that are going to be most applicable to the greatest variety of vocations. And even if you don't intend to do research or to do statistics, those skill sets allow you to be better consumers of information, and being a better consumer of information allows you to be better at almost any job that you're in. So those are my pieces of advice for people going on to graduate school and going on into the workforce. hopefully there's something.
Thank you so much. I absolutely agree with that. And I know that there is a tendency for people who are thinking of becoming clinicians to avoid research and statistics.
Yep.
They think that it's something really unnecessary.
Yes.
But I think it really takes some skill for us as teachers to develop courses in such a way that students would see the relevance of that information to what they do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we educators need to do a much better job encouraging students to reflect on the skills that they're acquiring in these classes. Rather than just checking off some kinds of boxes, we need to encourage them to spend some time thinking about, like, are these assignments just sucking up time, or are these assignments encouraging you to practice some sort of a skill? And can you articulate what that skill is and see how that skill actually applies to the greater world? And if we can get students to reflect on those things and help them reflect on those things, it's going to make them so much more marketable for graduate school or jobs, because they're going to be able to clearly articulate the skills they developed and they practiced in their majors.
Absolutely. And the last question I have is about one thing I noticed on your laboratory description, and maybe this can be a topic for some future conversation. It was, if I pronounce it correctly, ICHNOCHIROGRAPhy. Is that correct? Did I pronounce it well?
Yeah. Yes. It's ICHNOCHIROGRAPhy. And okay, so I should fess up. It's a made-up word, but the pieces of it are not made up. So I study handwriting, which is chirography. But when people hear chirography, they think it's about like the process of handwriting. And that's not what I study. I study the process of reading handwritten words. That's another one of my research programs. And so that's where the ichno comes from. Ichno is, I guess, a Latin root for static trace. So I study the static trace that's left behind after a person writes cursive, writes by hand. This is actually what I went to graduate school to study in the first place. Everything we know about reading, how people read, is based on the simplest case of typewritten, pristine words. And so psychology and neuroscience know exactly nothing about how a person is able to read handwriting. Messy handwriting in a style that you've never seen before, and you're able to filter out the noise and extract the meaning. And that's an incredible ability that we take for granted and that we don't understand at all. So that's probably about a third of my research output these days is in what I call ichnochirography, studying the processes that we use to read handwritten words. And since you brought this up, I should disabuse people of the notion that you can infer a person's personality from their handwriting. That's called graphology. It's absolute nonsense. The only things that you can infer from a person based on their handwriting are their age, socioeconomic status, and degree of literacy. And those all have pretty mundane explanations. People's motor fluency changes as they age, right? Like little kids don't have a lot of precision, and the elderly don't have a lot of precision in their motor codes. So handwriting changes because of that. And why socioeconomic status and degree of literacy? Well, those people have more practice writing by hand. They have more opportunities in the world that lead to education, more practice writing by hand, more opportunities to write by hand. And so they write by hand more fluently. It's nothing about their personality. It's just practice, right? Yeah, I study how you read handwritten words, but not what it says about your personality, because it doesn't say anything about your personality.
Good to know. I want to ask one more question. I said that the last will be the last, but I remembered about one more that I usually ask our podcast guests. Through all your career, which was really very, I would say, unusual. Yes, starting from a professional magician and becoming a scientist, and now I think a department chair at the Department of Psychology. So it's a very interesting, probably convoluted path. What was the most challenging thing in your career, and how did you solve that challenge?
Wow, that's a good question. Okay, so I think, boy, that's very hard. I think perhaps the most challenging thing was landing the kind of job that I knew I wanted, but that graduate school is not in the business of preparing you for. So I'm at a Carthage College. It's a small liberal arts college. We have about 2,600 students. We have a handful of graduate programs, but it's primarily an undergraduate institution. There's not a graduate program in psychology. And I knew that I wanted to be a faculty member at a small liberal arts college. It's the kind of school where I did my undergraduate work, but graduate programs are mostly not in the business of preparing graduate students to become faculty at small liberal arts colleges, right? The people who are doing the training in these graduate programs mostly have no contact with that world, right? They are mostly at like Research One institutions. They're in the business of doing research. Educating is usually an afterthought. So graduate students aren't getting the kind of training they need to be good educators, but they're getting great training to be researchers. And they're not getting trained on how to market themselves appropriately to get a job at a small liberal arts college. It's just very foreign to the experience of most of the people who are working at large graduate programs. And so it was, I think, a challenge making sure that I had the right kind of mentorship and the right kind of mindset to help me stand out to get the kind of job that I wanted. And so how did I do it? Well, I was lucky to have the mentor that I did. He didn't have the right kind of training to help me land this kind of job, but he was also aware of the fact that he didn't have the right kind of training and was willing to help me figure out what it takes to land this kind of job. And he bent over backwards to help me do this, right? Like, I was a graduate student at Arizona State University. There were not great mechanisms to get graduate students teaching experience. And because I had the mentor that I had, there were a couple of semesters where he was willing to have me paid on his grant while also letting me teach a class, which most would not do, right? Like, that's a very unusual experience. And he did the legwork to convince the administration that I would be good in the classroom and that it would be a valuable opportunity for me and for them. It was a kind of negotiation the typical graduate student wouldn't be able to engage in, right? I also essentially did a postdoc without it being called a postdoc. I got a lecturer position at still a large state institution, large state school, Northern Arizona University, but I knew it was a temporary position, but it would allow me to primarily be in the classroom while still maintaining a research program. And I don't know how easy it is to find positions like that. Most lecturer positions are just in the classroom without any research expectations. And so I might have been kind of a unicorn in finding that kind of a position that I could treat as a teaching postdoc, right? It would allow me to build up my teaching resume while still having a hand in the laboratory and still supervising undergraduate research. So I treated this lecturer position as a postdoc that beefed up my resume and would make me a more competitive candidate for positions at small liberal arts colleges. The third piece of advice I would give to people who are on this trajectory, a piece of advice that I only got by maintaining contact with my professors from my undergraduate institution, are that small liberal arts colleges are, yes, hiring faculty to teach courses, but are increasingly sensitized to how research can be a powerful teaching tool. So the thing that was challenging for me was articulating or coming up with a vision for how I could bring on undergraduates as co-investigators in my research program. So how could my research program not just advance science, but serve as a tool to teach undergraduates? And I think I've articulated to you like the process that I went through to get to this place. And so all of this I had to learn on the fly, right? Like graduate school did not prepare me to use my research as a teaching tool. I had to figure out how to do it. And I came up with these unique sort of connections and tendrils back to my undergraduate experience that gave me the tools to do so. But it was challenging, and there weren't a lot of people in a position to mentor me in how to do that. So, yeah, that's the other piece of advice. Like, make connections with the people who are doing the sorts of things that you want to do so that you have some built-in mentorship there and have some sounding boards, because not all the advice I received from them was intuitive. Some of it was surprising. So make connections, go to conferences, chat up the people you respect and the people who are doing the sorts of things that you want to do. They'll appreciate it and you'll benefit from it.
Thank you so much. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate all the advice you gave. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Thank you for being our podcast guest, and I wish you all possible success and in teaching students and mentoring them and in your research endeavors. And of course, creating a psychology of superstition act that you have in mind.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thanks. This was a lot of fun.